Well, let's talk a little bit about Edward Taylor, someone who's about 30 years Anne Bradstreet's junior, a second generation Puritan, and probably, in my opinion, one of the two, like I said, best poets of the era, and almost went totally ignored. The story goes anyway that he dictated to his heirs and willed himself, as Meserole says, into poetic anonymity for 2 centuries by requesting that his heirs not publish his poetry. I don't know whether that's true or not. It could be. Supposedly it is so. One thing's for sure, his poetry remained obscure and in the Yale Library until 1930s, really. And it was modernist poets, and like T.S. Eliot, folks like that, who took a real interest in Edward Taylor. And one of the reasons is because the modernists had a big affinity with the metaphysical poets, right? I'm going to skip down a little bit to talk about the metaphysical poets. I'll come back up to process and purpose. The metaphysical poets, 17th century, we're talking about John Donne and Herbert and Francis Quarles and people like this, who are writing after the Renaissance, or very, very late Renaissance. Milton I wouldn't classify as a metaphysical poet, but these guys writing 17th century verse were ignored for centuries. They were thought to be just terrible poets, really bad. So you had Shakespeare and Spenser and all those guys, and they wrote wonderful poetry according to the 18th and 19th and 20th century. And you had these really trash poets back like John Donne and those guys. They didn't know how to rhyme. They didn't know how to put anything together. They were just clunky versifiers who, frankly, were confusing and difficult, and their lines didn't have good rhythm to them, and they were just crappy poets, really. They just didn't know what they were doing. And for a couple of centuries after the Renaissance, after the 17th century, people look back at these guys and said they just really were terrible. I mean, look at how things went downhill from the Renaissance. Renaissance, beautiful poetry. Why, 30 years later, people don't know how to write a poem because it's so clunky and weird and bad. But what they didn't appreciate, that the modernists like Eliot did appreciate, was that they weren't reading the poems from the right perspective. And in fact, these poets, many of whom were Puritans, by the way, in England, in the 1640s and 50s and 60s and 70s, were writing poetry that was intentionally difficult, intentionally hard to read, hard to understand, that intentionally went out of its way to explore shocking conceits. Conceits are basically just ideas, right? Comparisons, metaphors, simile, those are conceits, right? They're types of conceits or ideas. We get the word conceited from the notion that someone has high ideas about themselves. So conceit means idea or concept, if you will. But a metaphysical poet would want to write a poem that was very difficult because he felt like the subject matter he was writing about was difficult. He wanted you to struggle and work hard to read it because what he was expressing was an idea that was hard to fathom. Poetry that deals with difficult things ought to look and read and sound difficult. Okay? So later generations would look back at the metaphysicals and say, these guys are terrible. Look at them. They can't even write a nice melodious rhythmic line. They weren't trying to. They were trying to make you stop and start and stop and start and make you go back and look again and say, what did he say? What did he say? I don't get that. What? They want you to slow down because they're saying to you that the world is a far more complex place, a far more disjointed and disjunctive place, a far more difficult place to understand. They were living in a post-Renaissance world where things were cracking and breaking apart. See, so were the modernists post-World War I. They were living in a world that was difficult to understand. Why is the world the way it is? What are the answers to life's deeper questions? So the metaphysical poets, hence the nickname, they never called themselves metaphysicals, only the modernists did. The metaphysical poets were interested in getting deep down into the subject and making you work hard and making you struggle and making you say, what does he mean by that? Right? They weren't, roses are red and violets are blue, blah, 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 right? They weren't that way. That's not what they were after. It was a very cerebral, very spiritual sort of poem, right? A very agonizing poem to read frequently. And the shocking conceits would be intentional, to try to set up, for example, at the beginning of the poem, some really hard to pull off comparison. Like, my love is like a dead dog in a gutter, right? Ugh, what? Your love is like a what? Right? I mean, later people would say, that's horrible. What absolute savages of these people. These people had no artistic sensibility at all. No, it was, the challenge of it was, I'm going to set up a comparison, a conceit, a metaphor at the beginning of the poem, and your first reaction is going to be to say, ugh, or, oh, come on, no way. What? Your love is like a what? But by the end of the poem, if I'm a great poet, I will convince you, when you get to that last line, to say to yourself, you know what? I never really thought about it that way, but I guess his love is like a dead dog in a gutter oozing pus. Wow, what do you know? Right? So it's not the kind of poetry for everybody, right? It's not, Moon and June and Spoon and Swoon and all that kind of stuff. It really isn't, okay? It's deep, it's hard work poetry, okay? So Taylor is 30 years after Bradstreet. Taylor is late Renaissance, really a 17th century man. Whereas Bradstreet is more influenced by the earlier Renaissance poets, Taylor is much more influenced by this metaphysical group of poets like a Donne or someone of that nature, right? Maybe to some extent Marvell, but not quite. Deeply personal reflections. The purpose for the poems, these meditations, the purpose was to reflect before taking communion. And the Puritans didn't take communion. Catholics would call it the Eucharist. Protestants sometimes call it the Lord's Supper. Communion. It's the same sort of ritual or ceremony in many Orthodox Christian denominations. Puritans wouldn't do it every Sunday. They would do it periodically. And so it was a thing that they felt that they needed to prepare themselves for. There's a verse that says, do not go into taking communion lightly. Examine yourself. Examine your soul. Do not come into that sacred ritual without reflecting. And so Taylor, as a minister, would take that very, very seriously. And so he wrote these poems as preparatory meditations, preparing for what? Preparing to engage in the ritual of the Eucharist or the communion. Okay? And he would write one for each time that he did it, and did it periodically throughout the year. Or two, and some people have argued that he did two. I can't recall whether it's one or two, but certainly his preparatory meditations are worthy of an examination. One of the things that you want to look at is his extensive use of typology, his use of very difficult syntax, very difficult, twisted, convoluted syntax. Also, the structure of these, because they tend to follow a rather regular structure. Or organizational pattern. First, the poet is writing about his state of sin, and the emotion, the dominant emotion in the first part of the poems is usually despair. Then he reminds himself of God's salvation through Christ, and it fills him with joy that God would do such a thing. And then the poem, almost always, each of these ends with hope, but not certainty, right? He is a Puritan after all. Hope that he may have salvation, that he may be of the elect, that he may have eternal life, but no certainty. Okay? So remember that pattern there of it tends to go through the same sort of psychological and structural pattern there, because you'll see it again and again throughout these.